Yes, it is. I mean, I think I've just written a book about the history of interest and pointing out that interest rates over the last decade or so have been lower than at any time in 5 millennia. And interest rates at very low levels cause enormous problems. They cause problems to inflating house prices. And if, as the central bank, the Bank of England did 2 years ago, the central bank prints a lot of money and the government borrows the money and spends it at a time when interest rates are very low, you tend to get inflation. The Bank of England seems to insist on denying that, but the history of inflation tells you that all great inflations are accompanied by massive increases in the money supply, which is what the Bank of England instituted.
The Bank of England yesterday, it almost reminded me of what went on in the 2000s. We had the Labour government saying it had abolished boom and bust and that everything was fine, and then we had the biggest bust that we'd had for 100 years. In almost a similar sort of way, is it that our economists at the Bank of England felt that they'd abolished high inflation, that no matter how low rates went, no matter how much money was printed, inflation would never return, and really now they've been found out?
I think that's a good parallel. The failure to anticipate the problems, the fallout from the great credit boom up to 2007, 2008, and how the economists were completely wrong-footed. Both the economists, working for the government in the central banks, but also the economists working in the City of London and in Wall Street, and more recently, during the COVID massive money printing and government expenditure during the COVID lockdowns, the central bank has kept on saying interest rates would remain lower for longer. Inflation expectations are well anchored, and they really didn't see this coming. And as you see, I think 2 years ago, the Bank of England was saying that inflation, were forecasting inflation today at 2%, which is roughly their target. Whereas today, as you say, it's closer to 10%. So there's no doubt they've made a massive error. And I think one of the points that Liz Truss has made is that the Bank of England's inflation mandates and how its independence is managed has to come under question now. I think that's certain. You might even say that it's time for politicians to take back control of monetary policy and therefore take responsibility for the errors and also for when good things happen with monetary policy.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, that was suggested by some of the candidates in this leadership race, and there was a bit of an aghast reaction from a lot of the media and indeed from many within Parliament and the world of the bank as well, suggesting that moving this back to politicians would mean short-termist incentives, would mean more erratic interest rates, would mean giveaways just before elections that might have very bad consequences. Would it not be a regressive step to move away from this era where we've had an independent bank since 1997?
Well, probably the worst central bank in history is the German Reichsbank in the early 1920s that was responsible for the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany. Now, that bank was actually technically and legally independent of German politicians. So independence in itself does not guarantee sound monetary policies. And I think what we're seeing today is that obviously not, as extreme as a hyperinflation, but we're seeing that an independent institution, if it has both perhaps a wrong mandate and the wrong models to guide it, is capable of making just as bad mistakes as politicians. But in this case, the politicians, no one takes responsibility for it. At least the one advantage of a accountable central bank to politicians is that then if the inflation goes through the roof, then you have a choice to kick the party responsible out of power.
The Bank of England has one job. It has one mandate, which is to keep inflation around about 2%. They've manifestly failed at that at the moment. They're expected to fail at this for potentially years to come. Should there be accountability? Should Andrew Bailey, the governor, take responsibility? Frankly, should he resign?
Well, he's said, I think, that he is not intending to resign. If a new prime minister, when a new prime minister is announced, then perhaps that position will be reconsidered. I think clearly, obviously, the inflation is not just restricted to Britain, but they did. The Bank of England does have, as you say, a mandate. They failed abysmally at meeting that mandate. I think the mandate needs changing to be more broad-based, take into account things like the impact of very low interest rates on house prices, on pensions, on savings, on inequality in the country. So we need a complete rethink of the mandate. But then the question is, once you broaden the mandate, do you really want to set it in stone, or do you want it to be constantly thought about and discussed and debated? Well, these are political issues. I think sort of kicking it off into, kicking this problem off into the world of technocrats and assuming that the technocrats are going to have the correct answer is wishful thinking.